The Apollo space program. Most of you have probably heard about it before. The Apollo space program was conceived during the Eisenhower administration in the early 1960s. It served as a follow-up to Project Mercury. One of the main purposes for the Apollo space program was to get men from Earth to the Moon and back safely. On these missions there were many instruments used, but the main ones consisted of the Saturn V5 rocket that was used for moon landing missions. But on the last 3 Apollo missions, astronauts also drove a lunar rover on the moon as well. In total, that actually flew humans into space. The first was Apollo Flight number 7. They ended up testing the command module on October 22, 1968. The second one was Apollo Flight 8. They were the first to orbit the moon on December 27, 1968. The third Apollo flight was Apollo Flight number 9. Now they tested the lunar module on March 13, 1969. The fourth was Apollo Flight number 10. They tested the lunar module around the moon on May 26, 1969. The fifth was Apollo Flight number 11. They were the first to actually land on the moon, and this occurred on July 24, 1969. The next was Apollo Flight number 12. They landed on the moon as well, on November 24, 1969. The one after that is probably one of the most famous ones, Apollo Flight number 13. Now they were supposed to land on the moon, but they had a malfunction and were forced to send the astronauts back down to Earth. This occurred on April 17, 1970. This, as you might know, was made into a movie. And all the flights after that, Apollo Flight number 14, number 15, number 16, and number 17, all successfully landed on the moon. And all these launches took place at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Now, the Apollo space program was not cheap at all. In fact, it was very expensive. In total, it cost a figure of about $170 billion in 2015 and around $2,000 billion in today's money. Probably one of the biggest expenses was the Apollo spacecraft, the Saturn V5. It costed around $7,945.0 million. The Saturn IB launch vehicles costed around $1,131.2 million. The Saturn V5 launch vehicles costed around $6,871.1 million. But keep in mind, they also had to pay for mission support, which costed around $1,432.3 million. They also had to pay for tracking and data, which costed around $664.1 million. Ground facilities, that costed around $1,830.3 million. And operations of installations, which costed around $2,420.6 million. Now, each rocket took different amounts of time to make, but the first one took about 5 years of research and development. Now, I already talked a little bit about the Saturn V5, but the way the Saturn V5 works is actually pretty interesting. As I've already said, the Saturn V5 rocket had 3 stages. Each stage would burn its engines until it was out of fuel and would then separate from the rocket. The engines on the next stage would fire, and the rocket would then continue into space. Now, the first stage needed the most powerful engines since it had the most difficult task of lifting the fully fueled rocket off the ground. The second stage carried it from there almost into orbit. And the third stage put the Apollo spacecraft into orbit and pushed it toward the moon. At takeoff, it ignites and produces 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Now, the first most famous crew members were a part of the Apollo number 1 mission that tragically died during the launch. Their names were Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee. As I said, they died in a flash fire that broke out in their capsule and killed them. In the 100% oxygen atmosphere NASA used, the fire spread very quickly, and this disaster caused NASA to re-examine all aspects of their program and rework their systems. The second most famous incident involved the Apollo 13 crew.
Houston, we have a problem.
The crew included Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert. Now, even though this mission did fail, NASA decided to call it a successful failure, because even though they never landed on the moon, they made it safely home after the explosion crippled the ship. This was also a very bad explosion that occurred. During an upgrade to an oxygen tank, it was damaged during this construction. When the heater was turned on during flight, the tank exploded, ripping all the power from the command module, and basically forcing the crew to use the lunar module as basically a lifeboat.
Say again, please. Houston, we have a problem.
A payload is a carrying capacity of an aircraft or launch vehicle, usually measured in terms of weight. The main payloads of the Apollo missions were the astronauts themselves. They went up in space with equipment to study and capture the moon with pictures and experiments. Sometimes the payloads even carried rovers and other instruments that the astronauts needed. They tested rovers, different instruments, and different types of cameras that they could use on the moon to take pictures. They were there to collect lunar data, but none of the missions actually succeeded in that. The Apollo space missions are important because they set an expectation for the future of whether or not we can travel to other planets rather than just the moon.